Do real men cry? For some reason, there's a myth out there that a true man doesn't cry, suggesting that crying is for women. Besides the demeaning statement, which is overtly dismissing women as being emotional, being weak, a man being the macho, masculine, tough guy, it isn't even true. The idea of being vulnerable, is that some way weak? The idea of being real, where you express yourself, you express your emotions, is that something wrong? Where did this myth, where did this stereotype come from? Why do we have in our culture this concept that being honest, that being sincere, that being fragile at times is a problem? Why do we live in a world where we think that being tough and macho is the high standard? And what does it tell us about our society? How are we to perceive men and women? We'll call the masculine and the feminine archetype. There's something very disturbing and confusing about these roles. And then women are being forced to play by a man's rules. And they become tough. And then they're criticized for being too tough, and they say, well, if a man was that way, you would never criticize. That would be considered leadership. So there's a lot to unpack here. How do we look at all of this? And how do we straighten it out? How do we get back to and reclaim our true masculine and feminine personalities, the way it was meant to be, what is healthy, obviously customized to each one of us in our own unique way. So it's about improving and transforming, frankly, our own personal lives and of our society, and of course of how we educate our children. So please join me in this special program, Real Men Do Cry, the Kabbalah of masculine energy. Hi, this is Simon Jacobson, and we'll be speaking about Real Men Do Cry, the Kabbalah of masculine energy. This program is dedicated by Zalman Roth. For some reason, there's a stereotype out there, and you hear of it time and again, that real men don't cry. A man is tough, strong, does not give in to his emotions, suggesting in a very demeaning way, frankly, that women are weaker or more emotional, don't have their wits about them, their mind over matter. As Lawrence Taylor once said, he used to play injured, the linebacker of the New York Giants, the famous linebacker. They asked him, how do you play when you have so many injuries? He said, it's mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. But aside that, the idea of self-control, that women are much more prone to emotional vicissitudes, and the man is the tough one. Where did this myth come from? Is it true? Is there something wrong with being vulnerable? Is there something wrong with being emotional when it's necessary or when it's part of human condition? Obviously, there's a need to be composed and to be able to stay in control even at difficult times. But why is this a masculine-feminine thing? Some could even argue that the women have certain inner strengths that are even much stronger than the man's. There's clearly a lot of confusion out there about these matters. What is the ultimate masculine archetype? What is the ultimate feminine archetype? So let's explore this. The challenge and the difficulty, to be very candid, is this. Society, culture, our culture, has already established certain standards. I'm sure different cultures have different standards. I'm talking about the Western world, of the general role of how we look at what a man's supposed to do, what a woman is supposed to do. Many of these standards have been challenged, but they're in place. So none of us are subjective. I was shaped by my influences in my life. My parents, my father, my mother, my siblings, my relatives, and then by extension, school, educators, friends, peer pressure, social attitudes and mores, and so have you. So we're not dealing here with a neutral, clean slate where we can say, okay, let's talk about it completely objectively. We already have a certain self-perception of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, how we look at ourselves, how we look at others. So then if we're challenged, we're dealing with a situation where you're challenging something that is already a preconceived notion, for good or for bad. So that's challenge number one, that we have to deal with an existing image, an existing perspective on masculine and feminine stereotypes, if you wish. And that's not so easy to do. But at least when we acknowledge that, that helps us look at it a little more objectively and say, okay, this is what we see a man is like. And here's what is possible. And we could challenge and see, is it healthy? Is it not healthy? So the fact that we may have a distorted view of men, as men do not cry or men are not emotional, and a man has to be macho and tough and a leader and be there strong for everybody else and ignore feelings, we can challenge and say, is that correct? That's why it's important to state that we already have notions, we already have concepts in place. That's challenge number one. Challenge number two is that due to, we'll call it, for lack of a better word, abuse of the male hierarchy abusing women, in overt ways, in covert ways, in subtle ways throughout history, so there's been a backlash. And the backlash just makes things even more confusing. Where men put themselves in positions of power and leadership, being paid more, having more rights, and women having to fight for that. As some put it, women fighting based on men's rules. And what has that done to how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive men and women? And even if progress has been made, but it's a response to an abusive situation. It's a response to men using their power and continuing to use it. With all the legislation, let's be honest, there's certain natural, instinctively, that men or anyone in power is going to try to dominate over someone that has less power, physical or psychological or corporate level, meaning economically or politically and so on. So all this adds to the complexities involved. So I'd like to go back to the roots. And when I say the roots, what I'd like to draw from is biblical and mystical texts that talk about the quintessential masculine archetype. Also about the feminine archetype, but our focus here is more on the masculine. One of the reasons being that this week was Father's Day. So we have some type of backdrop, some type of template to work with, and then we can say, okay, where are we in that context? And I'm not here to state it in a dogmatic fashion, but to give us context, to give us something to work with. You can challenge anything, but it's important to establish what is masculine energy in the first place, and what is feminine energy. And then look at what our attitudes are and how we look at men and at women, for that matter, in that context, and see what is the healthiest version. Are we living out and playing out the healthiest version of being a man. So there are many ways to begin. What comes to mind that I think is a good, interesting anecdote that can help is Deborah Tannen's analysis of men and women communicating. She's written a series of books on the topic, basically making the case that men, since they're young children, they communicate through doing things together. And therefore, when they do something, that for them is an act of love. Women, young girls, bond through speaking together, speaking with each other. So for them, love is speaking. Not because they want advice, but because speaking is a way of connecting. For a man, if you speak, that means you want advice, and he's offering counsel. That immediately creates an attitude that men essentially are doers, and women are communicators in that sense. So in other words, a man is about his actions, about showing power. And there are many ways that has truth to it, at least the way it is in our society. However, I want to take us back thousands of years back to the beginning of it all, the story of Genesis, where it talks about the creation of the human being, male and female. And there it says that there were one entity, one androgynous creature, male and female, created in the divine image. So it's essentially a spiritual structure, the divine image, and then split into two, masculine and feminine. And both complement each other. So number one is, we're not talking about a battle of the sexes of two separate. They become separate, but they essentially come from one fabric, from one divine image, with two different roles. Now, albeit we have to establish there's more overlap. Men and women have a lot more in common than they have that separates them, but the things that separate are significant. And then it goes on to explain, and now I'm using also Kabbalistic explanations of the difference between the two. And it all originates not from the way it is in our society. Because again, as I said before, once we're dealing with social and cultural circumstances and conditions, then there can be many distortions of how things have evolved based on power, based on control, based on battles of who is going to be the dominant one, etc. But when you look at it more in an abstract way, meaning as an archetype, it's easier to discuss. So the way they explain it, the mystics, based on these biblical verses, is that there are two forms of divine energy, two forms of spiritual energy. One is expressive, and one is intimate, reflective, meaning internal. You could say introspective if you wish. What that means, simply put, we all need to be go-getters at times. You need a loaf of bread, you find the bakery. You need a job, you network, you put an ad in, you read the ads, and you find a job. To survive in this world, we need to do things. To protect ourselves, to protect our young. We need to find a mate. These are things that require expression, meaning to go out of your own internal domain and to go out there, what we call, I don't want to use the word conqueror, even though that's a very important word, and warrior, but ultimately it leads to the conqueror-warrior mentality. That we need to conquer, we need to battle, and we need to win something. So that's going out of your own self to go out. I'm calling it expressive, but essentially it's about going out and doing something that you need for your survival, for your life. But then there's a very different type of energy, your own internal energy. When you are alone, meditating, contemplating, and you're always in a way alone. But you're actively, instead of actively going to your job, you're sitting and contemplating, pondering about yourself, your feelings, your purpose of existence. That's a very different type of energy. To use Kabbalistic language a bit, there's two types of what they call light or energy. One is outward going, and one is inward. And overall, those are the two roots, though there's much overlap, but we're not talking about a man and a woman, but the masculine archetype and the feminine archetype are based on these two forms of energy. Again, they both have every man has feminine energy, every woman has masculine energy. And we need both. But what's predominantly masculine is the going out. And what is predominantly feminine is going within. That's why the woman is seen as more of a nurturer. Not in a demeaning way, on the contrary. Because a woman will emote better with a child, with another person. We'll call it an intimate energy. The words from the book of Psalm comes to mind, of the book of Psalms, that the dignity of the princess is within. Is that dignity that we carry within, not because we're getting awards or being recognized by others, or there's fireworks and displays. It's just that internal being at peace with yourself. That's considered quintessential feminine energy. And a man needs it just as much as a woman does. But it's the woman that carries a child for 9 months, not by accident. It's because she's uniquely created psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually to be that nurturer. The child is completely immersed, submerged in the embryonic fluids of the mother, not just physically, but also emotionally. The man is given more physical strength because he is the one that can go out and chop more wood, carry more water. So that's more for taming the elements. And that's why the Talmud says something fascinating. The man works in the field, toils in the field, reaps, brings the grain, and the woman turns it into a beautiful bread. He brings the flax or other material, and she turns it into a garment. Can a man turn into a garment? Can a woman work in the field? Obviously. But still, as we talk about an archetype, that is the key difference. And they complement each other. There's no such thing as one being greater than the other. Both are necessary. If you want to build a physical home in this hostile world, someone has to clear out, has to deal with the elements, has to deal with the wilderness, create a place where you can build a home. But then there's the beautification of the home, creating of the home an environment, not just a roof on your head, not just shelter from the storm, but actually a nurturing, warm environment. So both are charged, masculine and feminine, with this, but it's a very different type of energy. From this evolved, with a distortion and not being clear about what our roles are, this evolved idea that a man is a warrior, a conqueror. The whole purpose of warrior is only to tame the elements or to deal with hostile forces in order to create a beautiful, nurturing home. But if it becomes an end in itself, in other words, the concept of career as an end in itself is a foreign and, frankly, not necessarily a healthy standard. We need to work, but the work is in order to make a living, to make the money that you need to bring up a healthy family, to nurture your children, to educate them, to sustain them, to teach them values. If the career, the money, becomes an end in itself and instead of a means, you tell me what happens. So we live in a world that has become overtaken and controlled by materialism. So in many ways, materialism is the outgrowth of masculine energy that has gone awry, that has gone off the reservation, that has lost its purpose. So materialism becomes a pursuit of its own. Who can create more material wealth? The more physically stronger one. Not today, with technology that has changed, but over the generations. The women, therefore, in a sense, were left abandoned with the children. And of course, the woman would rebel against that, because the man lost his way. And materialism became an end in itself. Had it been done right, materialism would be a means for spiritual growth, where the woman comes into play. So the man and woman complement each other. Like I said, you bring the grain into the home and turn it into bread. Materialism has a purpose. It's a means toward an end. So the masculine and feminine, at its healthiest, complement each other. So again, a man and woman can be doing both types of work, but the focus is ultimately not on matter, not on conquering, and not on being the strong leader, the tough one. That's only necessary if you have to tame an element or you have to deal with a hostile force, with an enemy, with adversity. But it comes down to is building a beautiful environment. And we look psychologically, children growing up in a home where there's battles all the time, psychological, physical, between father and mother, it's a war zone. A home should be a beautiful, peaceful place, a place of harmony. So now let's go back to the concept of do men cry or not. So once you've developed this type of stereotype, once you've developed an approach that a man is the conqueror, the warrior, warriors have no time for crying. They have no time for emotions. They have to fight the battles. But the battle was only meant to be a means. It was not meant to define you, that you become a battler. Yes, sometimes you need to fight a battle, but that's not your identity. Your identity is a spiritual energy that needs to express itself and needs to go out because we have to transform the world around us. Not as an end in itself. And therefore, the idea of being a warrior as opposed to being a gentle soul, that when you're hurting, you're crying, or you feel emotion and you express vulnerability, that suddenly is being dismissed as weakness. There's no time for that. What do you mean there's no time for that? That's the whole purpose of life, is to be a vulnerable human being, a real human being. But that's where the war has become who we are. It's like people who've been hardened by war, and they become warriors. The time has come to reclaim our true masculine identities. And that means understanding that the role we play, even when we are sometimes serving as the conqueror or the warrior, sometimes going out there to do what we have to do, but that's not who you are. I have heard from many people, I remember one specifically that comes to mind. In business, he was known as a shark. Ethical, but tough like nails. A negotiator. You couldn't get one, couldn't pass anything by him. There was no compassion beyond what the expectations were. At home, a gentle lamb. And when he described himself, and I remember speaking with him about it, he said, it's two worlds, I'm a split personality. I said, how do you close off that personality when you come home? What do you do with it? He said, it's like armor. I take it off, I put it in the front closet, I walk into the house, I'm a different person. But that's a real, let's call it fragmentation if you wish. Compartmentalization is the right word. And then when he goes back to work, he goes out, he puts on that armor again. I asked him, can you bring the gentleness that you have at home into your workplace? He said, then people will take advantage of me. I won't be able to be successful. So I wouldn't tell him not to be a strong, tough business person. Let me tell you what happened. This very person, that same person, how did I meet him? When my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, was published, he got a hold of it. He was reading it. And something struck him. The chapter on work and productivity, speaking about this theme, that your work is about feeding, even if you have to put on the armor, to feed the inner soul. Essentially, the masculine side to feed the feminine spirituality. That's within each one of us. And one of the ways to do so, to make your workplace a more gentler place, not just when you come home, not just on the weekends when you're with family on vacation, to put a charity box on your desk in your office. And he began to do that. And he said meetings, he would always begin putting a few coins into the charity box, suggesting it to whoever he was meeting with, and it changed the tone, he said, of my meetings. We still had our tough negotiations, but it introduced another dimension. People said, you do that? You give charity? He says, yeah, it's part of the blessing of my life, and I do it at my workplace. Then he began to order cases of my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, and started giving that out to people, everyone he met. He says, it changed my whole relationship with the people, because they saw me as a human being, not just as a business negotiation, or as a potential partner or a potential adversary. So it didn't change his business. On the contrary, he said it created more trusting relationships, because it opened up. People started talking about their families. We started becoming friendly, while also doing that work. But they realized work was not an end in itself. That is the taming of the male, if you wish. There's is that a play by Shakespeare? The Taming of the Shrew. The taming of the male, not the elimination, the channeling, the harnessing, and understanding that when you go out to chop wood, it's not because you're a wood chopper; it's because you need the wood, either to build a fireplace, to warm your home, or to sell extra wood, so you should have some income that you can feed your family. Give charity, do other beautiful things. It's taming the material of the world. The masculine, powerful, strong, aggressive energy, untamed, can be very dangerous. That's why they say if women ran the world, it would be a far more peaceful world. One example, that was one example. One case study. And there are many others. So the idea of a man crying, yes, everything has its time, but it has a certain beautiful thing to it. It's becoming natural again. You may recall years ago there was this, therapy called Iron John. It was about helping people reconnect to their masculinity, to go out and grunt and wear skins and sweat, because people felt that men were becoming emasculated. So I remember reading, a guy went to one of these retreats, he paid thousands of dollars, a CEO of a company. Came back all invigorated. Monday morning, he's telling his team that he went to this great trip, sweated a lot, felt reconnected to his male primal forces. And one of the workers in his business, who was working on the construction site, said to the boss, if you want to sweat, just come work with us on the field and you'll sweat. And the boss said, I don't have time for that. I had to schedule for a certain weekend when I found a little time. So the worker says to him, without missing a beat, boss, if you sweat when you want to sweat, it ain't sweating at all. In other words, that became his comfort zone, that he's sweating at that weekend. The point I'm making here is we have to get out of our comfort zones. And we have to do things. Sometimes getting out of the comfort zone is being vulnerable. Being real. There's nothing wrong to show that you have a heart and a soul, even when you're busy in a tough negotiation. There's nothing wrong with being that way. It's not compromising you. No one's telling you to change your position. And compassion is very valuable, even in that mode. So in truth is, what we're talking about is really discovering the intimate energy within the masculine force as well. Harnessing it. Harnessing the masculine energy to express that. I can assure you that when we do that, we will get along in unprecedented ways with the other gender, because then they complement each other. Good for you, good for your marriage, good for your family, and tremendous role modeling. But I'm focusing primarily on the masculine energy that real men do cry. They allow themselves to be real. They don't have to perform all the time. They don't have to prove anything to anyone. The competitiveness to show I won the race becomes less important. Yes, we should all be successful, but it's not driven by that type of dominance. It's driven by being real, by revealing the true nature of our hearts and souls. That's the purpose of existence. And everything else is a means toward that. This is a big topic, and I hope I did justice to it. This has been Simon Jacobson, meaningfullife.com, where you can find this and many programs. Please subscribe to our offerings, subscribe to our growing YouTube channel, and please share this with others. I'd love to hear your feedback, your thoughts, your comments. Be blessed, and let's combine both forces together, the expressive and the intimate, to express the inexpressible and allow the inexpressible to be expressed. Be well. Thank you so much.
This program is brought to you by the Meaningful Life Center. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at meaningfullife.com/donate.